There are secrets that time refuses to bury, memories that linger in the shadows, waiting to resurface when we least expect them. 33 years ago, a mother and her young daughter vanished during what was supposed to be a perfect family picnic. No explanations, no goodbyes, only unanswered questions and a father left behind to grieve in the silence of uncertainty. But time has a strange way of playing with fate. One ordinary night, a man steps into a dark alley, glances at a nightclub window, and sees the impossible. His daughter, now a grown woman, serving drinks like she had never disappeared. His world collapses in that instant, his past and present colliding in a way that will change everything. What happened to her all these years? Why is she here now, and why does she not recognize him? The answers are buried deep in lies, betrayals, and a truth that will shake him to his core. But some secrets should never be uncovered. Stay until the end, and don't forget to subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The sound of rain tapping against the window was the only thing keeping Daniel Carter anchored to reality. It had been 33 years since that day, but the memories never left him. No amount of time could erase the image of Emily's bright smile, the way her hair shimmered in the summer sun, or how Sarah, their 6-year-old daughter, had giggled as she ran barefoot through the grass. It was supposed to be a perfect afternoon, a picnic, just the three of them, a family moment frozen in time, before the world decided to take everything away from him. He had replayed that day in his mind a million times, searching for something, anything, that could explain how they had simply vanished. One moment they were there, laughing, and the next gone. No footprints, no signs of struggle. Just an abandoned picnic basket and the lingering scent of Emily's perfume in the air. The police had searched for weeks, the case making headlines across the country. The grieving husband left alone, the missing mother and daughter whose faces haunted every newspaper and television broadcast. But no leads ever surfaced. Eventually, people moved on. The world forgot. But Daniel never did. He spent decades chasing ghosts, poring over old case files, making desperate phone calls to private investigators who only took his money and gave him false hope. Each time, the outcome was the same: nothing. No answers, no closure. Just an endless void where his family used to be. And then, just when he had started to accept that maybe he would never know, a letter arrived. It was late, past midnight, when he found it slipped under his door. No return address, no signature. Just one simple sentence, written in handwriting that sent a shiver down his spine. "They're not gone. Look closer." His breath caught in his throat. His hands trembled as he reread the words over and over, trying to make sense of them. Who had sent this? Was it some cruel joke? Or was it finally, after all these years, a clue? He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat at his kitchen table, staring at the letter as memories came rushing back. Every late-night search, every dead-end lead, every desperate prayer whispered into the darkness. Was it possible? Could they still be out there somewhere? He spent the next week revisiting old places. The park where they had last been seen. The abandoned police station where he had once pleaded for them to keep searching. The cemetery where his father was buried, because for some reason he felt drawn there. But no matter where he went, he found nothing. Just more questions, more silence. And then, on a night like any other, he made a choice that would change everything. He wasn't supposed to be in that alley. It was a shortcut, a path he rarely took on his way home. But something pulled him there, an invisible force guiding his steps. The neon lights of a nearby nightclub flickered in the darkness, casting eerie reflections on the wet pavement. He had no reason to look, no reason at all. But as he walked past, something made him turn his head. And that was the moment his entire world came crashing down. Through the window, under the dim glow of red and blue lights, he saw her, standing behind the bar, pouring drinks, laughing like she belonged there, like she had always belonged there. His daughter, Sarah. His breath left his body in a strangled gasp. His legs gave out beneath him, and the ground rushed up to meet him. The last thing he heard before the darkness took him was the sound of distant voices calling out, the rain pounding against the pavement like a heartbeat. He woke up in a daze, the sharp scent of alcohol and cigarette smoke filling his nostrils. Someone had dragged him inside, away from the street. His head pounded, his vision blurred. But none of it mattered. None of it was real. Because if it was, then that meant. "Are you okay, sir?" a voice asked. He turned sharply, his breath catching as his eyes locked onto the bartender. Not Sarah, a different woman, but the resemblance was striking enough to send another wave of nausea through him. I need to see her," he whispered, barely recognizing his own voice. The bartender frowned. "Who?" "The girl. The one working behind the bar. She was just here." The woman hesitated. "You must be mistaken. I've been on shift all night, and I'm the only one working behind this bar." Daniel's stomach twisted. No, that wasn't possible. He had seen her. He knew it. But when he turned back to the window, she was gone. Had it been a trick of the light? A hallucination? Or was someone playing with him? He stumbled out of the club, his heart racing. The letter, the sudden pull to that alley. And now, seeing Sarah, his Sarah, after all these years. It wasn't a coincidence. Couldn't be. Someone wanted him to find her. But why now? And why here? His hands shook as he pulled out his phone, dialing the only number he still knew by heart. "Hello," a groggy voice answered on the other end. "Michael, it's me," Daniel rasped. A long pause. "Dad? It's 2 a.m. What's wrong?" Daniel swallowed hard, his throat tight. "I think I found Sarah." The silence on the other end was deafening. Then finally his son spoke. "Dad, Sarah's gone. She's been gone for 33 years. A lump formed in Daniel's throat. "I know, but I saw her." "That's not possible." "I know what I saw, Michael." His voice cracked. "She's alive." Michael let out a slow breath. "Dad, are you sure?" Daniel squeezed his eyes shut. He wasn't sure of anything anymore. All he knew was that the moment he looked through that window, everything he thought he understood about his life shattered into pieces. And he wasn't going to stop until he found out the truth. The hours that followed were a blur. Daniel sat in his dimly lit apartment, staring at the rain streaking down his window like silent tears. His hands trembled as he held onto his coffee cup, the liquid inside long gone cold. His mind kept replaying that moment. The neon glow of the nightclub, the unmistakable face behind the bar, the way she moved, how she smiled. It was Sarah. He knew it. But how? How could his daughter, who had vanished 3 decades ago, be standing there as if nothing had ever happened? He had spent his life grieving, believing she was lost forever. And now, out of nowhere, she was here, alive, grown. He had called Michael again after that first conversation, trying to explain, trying to make him understand. But Michael was hesitant, almost cautious, as if he feared his father had finally broken under the weight of his grief. "Dad, you've been searching for answers for so long. Are you sure this isn't just wishful thinking?" The doubt in his son's voice had made Daniel's stomach tighten, but he knew what he had seen. He had spent 33 years dreaming of this moment, imagining what she would look like now, wondering if she had survived. He wasn't wrong. He couldn't be. By the time the sun crept over the horizon, his exhaustion was bone deep, but his resolve had only strengthened. He needed to go back. He needed to see her again, to confirm what his heart already knew. He pulled on his coat, grabbed his car keys, and drove through the city streets, the early morning silence thick with anticipation. When he arrived at the nightclub, it was closed. A metal gate covered the entrance, and a small sign on the door read, "Opens at 8 p.m. He had no choice but to wait. He parked across the street, watching. People passed by, oblivious to the storm raging inside him. He felt like he was on the edge of something massive, something that would change everything. Hours stretched on, the sun climbing higher, then dipping lower again. By the time night fell, his nerves were raw. He took a deep breath, stepped out of the car, and crossed the street, pushing open the door to the club as soon as the bouncer let him in. The atmosphere was different now. The dim lighting cast long shadows, the bass of the music thrummed beneath his feet, and voices mingled in a chaotic symphony. He made his way toward the bar, scanning the faces, his heart hammering in his chest. But she wasn't there. A different bartender was pouring drinks, a young man who barely glanced at him as he slid a glass across the counter to a customer. Panic twisted inside him. He hadn't imagined it. She had been here. He was sure of it. But where was she now? He leaned in, trying to steady his voice. There was a woman working here last night. Long brown hair, about 39 or 40. Do you know where she is? The bartender barely looked up. I'm the only one on shift tonight. Daniel clenched his fists. No, you don't understand. She was here. I saw her. The bartender frowned now, as if studying him more closely. Look, man, I don't know who you're talking about. Maybe you got the wrong place. Frustration bubbled up inside him. He shook his head. No, this is the place. She was here. A voice behind him made him turn sharply. You're looking for someone? A woman stood near the entrance to a back hallway, watching him. She was older, maybe in her late 40s, with piercing green eyes and a calculating expression. She didn't seem surprised by his presence, and that sent a shiver down his spine. Yes, he said, stepping toward her. A woman. She worked here last night. She looked like... His throat tightened. She looked like my daughter. The woman studied him for a long moment, then motioned for him to follow her. He hesitated only for a second before trailing her down the dimly lit hallway, away from the noise of the club. She led him into a small office, shutting the door behind them. Daniel's pulse pounded as he waited for her to speak. You saw her, the woman said finally. It wasn't a question. His breath caught. So she was here. The woman exhaled slowly. Maybe. His hands tightened into fists. Please, I need to know. The woman tilted her head, observing him like she was deciding how much to say. People come and go here, she said at last. Some of them don't want to be found. His heart clenched. Is she in danger? The woman's expression didn't change. Maybe not the kind of danger you're thinking. Daniel's head spun with the weight of her words. He wanted to scream, to shake her and demand answers, but he forced himself to stay calm. Where is she now? The woman sighed. She doesn't work here regularly, and even if she did, I don't think she's the person you're looking for. Daniel felt like the floor had dropped out from beneath him. What do you mean? The woman hesitated. You think she's your daughter. That's what you said. Yes. She studied him again, something unreadable in her eyes. What if she doesn't know that? The room seemed to close in on him. His pulse roared in his ears. What are you saying? The woman sighed, rubbing her temples like she was debating whether to tell him more. People reinvent themselves all the time, she said carefully. Sometimes, they don't even remember who they used to be. Daniel's knees nearly gave out. Are you saying she doesn't remember me? The woman didn't answer, but her silence spoke louder than words. A cold dread settled over him. If Sarah was alive but didn't remember who she was, then what had happened to her all these years? And who had taken her from him? The woman finally exhaled. You should go home, Mr. Carter. His eyes snapped up to hers. How do you know my name? She didn't answer. Instead, she walked to the door and opened it, waiting for him to leave. Daniel's mind was spinning, questions clawing at his throat. But he knew he wouldn't get any more answers tonight. With a reluctant nod, he stepped past her, walking down the hallway, out of the club, and into the cold night air. As soon as he reached his car, he leaned against it, trying to steady himself. He had come here for answers, but now he had even more questions. One thing was certain: Sarah was alive, and she was closer than he had ever imagined. But if she didn't remember him, that meant someone had taken those memories from her. And Daniel wasn't going to stop until he found out who. Daniel sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The air inside felt thick, suffocating, as if the weight of the past 33 years had suddenly collapsed onto his chest. The woman at the nightclub had known his name. That wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't a mistake. She knew who he was, and that meant she knew something about Sarah. But she had refused to tell him everything. choosing instead to speak in riddles and cryptic warnings. The thought of it made his stomach churn. His daughter was alive. He had seen her with his own eyes. But if she didn't recognize him, if she didn't remember who she was, then someone had done this to her. Someone had stolen her life, erased her memories, and placed her here, in this city, under a new identity. The question that burned inside him was, why? He exhaled sharply, his breath fogging up the windshield. He couldn't sit here any longer, paralyzed by questions. He needed answers, and there was only one person left who might have them. He picked up his phone and dialed the number. The call rang several times before a groggy voice answered. "Dad? It's late. Michael." Daniel's grip on the phone tightened. "I need to talk to you." His son sighed on the other end. "You sound off. What's going on?" Daniel swallowed hard. "I need you to meet me. In person." A long pause. "Where?" He hesitated. "My apartment. First thing in the morning." Michael exhaled. "All right, I'll be there." Daniel ended the call without another word, staring at his reflection in the rearview mirror. His face looked older than he remembered, worn down by grief and time. But there was something else there now. Determination. He had spent 3 decades mourning a daughter who had never been dead. Now he would do whatever it took to bring her home. Sleep didn't come that night. His mind raced, piecing together every fragment of information he had. The woman at the club had said Sarah might not know who she was. That meant someone had changed her identity. That kind of thing didn't just happen. It required money, power, resources. Someone had gone to great lengths to keep her hidden. But why? By the time the sun rose, exhaustion gnawed at his bones. But he ignored it. He paced his apartment, waiting for the knock at the door. When it finally came, he swung it open before Michael could knock a second time. His son frowned at him, concern flickering in his brown eyes. "Dad, you look like hell." Daniel didn't care. He stepped aside, letting Michael in. His son ran a hand through his dark hair, glancing around the apartment before crossing his arms. "Okay, what's going on?" Daniel took a deep breath. "I saw her, Michael." Michael's body stiffened. "Dad, I know what you're going to say," Daniel interrupted. "You think I'm seeing things, that I'm desperate, that I'm losing my mind. But I'm not. I saw Sarah. I spoke to someone who knows something." Michael let out a slow breath. "Where?" "A nightclub downtown." Daniel rubbed his face. "She was behind the bar. She looked exactly like your mother. Same eyes, same face." His voice cracked. "She was alive." Michael stayed silent, his jaw tight. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured, careful. "And she recognized you?" Daniel swallowed hard. "No." Michael flinched, his expression darkening. "Dad, she didn't recognize me," Daniel admitted. "But that doesn't mean it wasn't her." He took a step forward, his voice pleading. "Someone did this to her, Michael. Someone erased her. That woman at the club, she knows something. She told me people reinvent themselves all the time. That sometimes they don't even remember who they used to be." Michael's expression was unreadable. "And you believe her?" "I don't know what to believe," Daniel whispered. "But I can't ignore this. I won't." Michael sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. "Dad, you've been chasing ghosts for 30 years. Do you know how many times you thought you found something? How many times you called me, convinced you were close?" Daniel felt the sting of those words. He had spent years chasing shadows, clinging to false hope, believing in empty leads. But this was different. He could feel it. "I know how it sounds," Daniel said, his voice rough. "But this time, I saw her, Michael. And if there's even a chance that it's her, I have to find out the truth." Michael hesitated, conflict flickering in his eyes. Then finally he nodded. "All right, what do we do?" Relief crashed over Daniel. "We start at the club. I need you with me." Michael didn't argue. He simply grabbed his jacket and followed his father out the door. The nightclub was busier tonight. Music pulsed through the air, a low, steady rhythm that made Daniel's chest tighten. He and Michael moved through the crowd, heading straight for the bar. Daniel's heart pounded as he scanned the faces. And then there, his breath caught. She was there, Sarah, standing at the bar, taking orders, her hair pulled back, a faint smile on her lips. She looked older now, but she was still her. Every detail was the same. The curve of her jaw, the slight tilt of her head when she listened, the way her fingers moved when she reached for a glass. Daniel grabbed Michael's arm, gripping it so tightly his son winced. It's her. Michael's eyes followed his gaze. He froze. His expression shifted from doubt to something else. Something that made Daniel's chest ache. Recognition. Michael saw it too. Dad? Michael whispered, his voice barely audible. It can't be. But it was. Daniel took a shaky breath, then stepped forward, his heart hammering against his ribs. Sarah. She didn't react. He tried again, louder this time. Sarah. She turned, blinking in surprise. Her eyes met his. Daniel felt his breath leave his body. It was her. It was. But there was no recognition in her eyes. No flicker of memory. No sign that she knew who he was. She frowned slightly. I'm sorry. Do I know you? The words sliced through him like a blade. Daniel felt his knees go weak. His hands trembled. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Michael stepped in, his voice steadier than his father's. Sarah? She shook her head. My name isn't Sarah. A lie? It had to be a lie. Daniel's vision blurred. His pulse roared in his ears. This wasn't happening. It wasn't possible. But then she spoke again, and her next words shattered him completely. I think you have the wrong person. Daniel staggered back, his world spinning out of control. His daughter was alive. She was standing right in front of him. But she didn't remember him. And that meant someone had taken everything from her. Someone had stolen her life. And Daniel was going to find out who. Daniel felt the air leave his lungs as if someone had punched him in the chest. The noise of the nightclub faded into a distant hum, the colors of the neon lights blurring together as his mind struggled to process what had just happened. Sarah, his daughter, his little girl, was standing in front of him, but she had no idea who he was. She didn't even hesitate. She looked at him like he was just another stranger in the crowd, someone passing through her life without significance. The pain of it was unbearable. Michael stood beside him, frozen, his lips slightly parted, his face pale. He had seen it too. He had heard her voice, watched the way she blinked at them, utterly devoid of recognition. Daniel knew what his son was thinking, what they were both afraid to admit. What if she really didn't remember? What if 33 years had erased every trace of the little girl she used to be? What if she was lost to them forever? His mouth was dry, but he forced himself to speak. His voice was barely above a whisper. Sarah. She shook her head again, a polite but firm smile on her lips. I think you're confusing me with someone else. No, Daniel said, his voice cracking. I'm not. There was a flicker of something in her expression. Confusion, uncertainty, but it vanished just as quickly. Michael took a cautious step forward. You look so much like our mother. His voice was softer, as if he were afraid that speaking too loudly would make her disappear. Are you sure your name isn't Sarah? She let out a small laugh, but there was no humor in it. I think I'd know my own name. Daniel's fingers curled into fists at his sides. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. Please, he begged. He didn't care how desperate he sounded. Just listen to me for a second. She hesitated, her brows drawing together. And then the woman from the hallway, the one who had spoken to him the night before, appeared at her side. Everything okay here? Daniel's stomach twisted. The woman's voice was too casual, too practiced. She was watching him closely, like she had been expecting this moment, like she had been waiting for it. Sarah turned to the woman. These men think they know me. The woman's expression didn't change. That happens sometimes, she said smoothly. People mistake you for someone else. Daniel's jaw clenched. The way she said it, it wasn't just an observation. It was intentional. She was guiding Sarah, feeding her the right words. He turned to his daughter, his voice urgent. Sarah, please, just... That's not my name, she interrupted, her tone sharper this time. I don't know who you are. The words cut deeper than he thought possible. He felt Michael shift beside him, saw the pain flicker across his son's face. The woman stepped in. I think it's best if you leave now. Daniel's chest heaved. Every instinct in his body was screaming at him to fight, to refuse, to demand answers. But he saw the way Sarah's face had closed off, how her shoulders had tensed. If he pushed too hard, she would run. And that was the last thing he could afford. He forced himself to nod, swallowing the lump in his throat. I'll go. The woman smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. That's for the best. Daniel took one last look at Sarah, his Sarah, and then turned on his heel, walking toward the exit. Michael followed, silent and stiff. When they stepped out into the cold night air, Daniel felt like the ground beneath him had crumbled away. Michael let out a shaky breath. What the hell just happened? Daniel ran a hand over his face. They got to her. Michael shook his head. No, that wasn't... She looked at us, Dad. She looked right at us and didn't remember. She's been manipulated, Daniel said, his voice hoarse. Brainwashed. Lied to. Michael hesitated. What if she really doesn't remember? Daniel's stomach twisted. That was the possibility he couldn't allow himself to accept. He turned to his son, his eyes dark with determination. I don't care what they've done to her. I'm going to bring her back. Michael exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of his neck. How? Daniel clenched his jaw. I don't know yet, but I do know one thing. Whoever is behind this has been keeping her from us for years. They won't stop now, which means neither will I. Michael looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. I'm with you. Daniel's throat tightened. He reached out, gripping his son's shoulder. We're going to fix this, Michael. Michael swallowed. We have to. The cold wind blew through the street, but Daniel barely felt it. His mind was racing, already forming a plan. The woman at the club had been protecting Sarah. That much was clear. And if she was protecting her, that meant she knew the truth, which meant she was Daniel's next target. The next morning, Daniel stood outside the nightclub, watching. The woman would return, she had to, and when she did, he would be waiting. Hours passed, but he didn't move. He barely noticed the people walking by, the hum of the city around him. He was a man on a mission, and nothing would deter him. Then, finally, he saw her. She walked toward the club's entrance, wearing the same cold expression she had the night before. Daniel stepped out of the shadows, blocking her path. She didn't flinch, didn't even look surprised. She simply crossed her arms and sighed. I figured you'd be back. Daniel didn't waste time. Who are you? The woman smirked. I think the better question is, who do you think I am? He took a step closer. You know what happened to my daughter. She tilted her head. Do I? Daniel clenched his fists. Stop playing games. I saw her. She's alive. But she doesn't remember. The woman didn't deny it. He took another step. What did you do to her? She narrowed her eyes. I didn't do anything. Daniel's pulse pounded. Then who did? The woman hesitated, then sighed. Listen, Mr. Carter. There are things you don't understand. Then explain them to me. She shook her head. It's not that simple. Daniel gritted his teeth. It's my daughter. A flicker of something, pity, crossed her face. Then, finally, she said something that sent ice through his veins. She's not the same person anymore. Daniel's breath caught. What does that mean? The woman sighed, glancing around as if checking for someone. Then she leaned in and whispered something that made Daniel's blood run cold. She has a different life now, a different name, a different family. His stomach twisted. No, the woman nodded. She doesn't remember you because she's never been Sarah Carter. Daniel's world tilted. That's not possible. I told you, she said. People reinvent themselves all the time. Daniel's pulse thundered in his ears. If Sarah wasn't Sarah anymore, then who was she? Daniel felt the ground beneath him shift. The city noises faded into a distant hum, drowned out by the sound of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. His mind was screaming that it wasn't possible, that this woman standing in front of him was lying. But deep down, a terrifying thought had already begun to take root. What if she wasn't? What do you mean she's never been Sarah Carter? His voice came out hoarse, his throat tight with emotion. The woman exhaled slowly, as if she had expected this reaction. She has a different life now, a different identity. To her, she's never been anyone else. Daniel's stomach twisted painfully. He had been prepared for the idea that someone had brainwashed her, forced her to forget her past. But this was something entirely different. You're telling me that for the last 33 years, she's been living another life? He could barely get the words out. That she never even knew who she really was? The woman's green eyes softened just a fraction. Yes. Daniel took a step back, his body trembling. He felt Michael beside him, equally stunned into silence. His son's face was pale, his hands clenched into fists. How? Michael's voice was sharp, edged with barely restrained anger. How do you erase someone's entire existence? The woman glanced around as if ensuring no one else was listening. Then, she lowered her voice. It wasn't erased, she said carefully. It was replaced. Daniel felt something inside him crack. He had spent decades searching, mourning, praying that one day he would find his daughter. And now, standing on this cold street, he was being told that she had never needed finding, because she had never even known she was lost. His hands shook as he tried to steady himself. Where has she been all this time? The woman hesitated. Tell me, he demanded, his voice raw. She was adopted, the woman admitted. Shortly after she disappeared, the world blurred. Michael let out a harsh breath. That's not possible. If she had been adopted, we would have found out. There would be records, something. There aren't any records, the woman said. Not the kind you could find. Daniel's head spun. Then how do you know? The woman pressed her lips together. For a brief moment, it looked like she might not answer. But then, finally, she said, because I was there. Daniel's breath hitched. Michael stepped forward, his entire body tense. Who are you? The woman looked at them both, and then, very quietly, she said, my name is Evelyn, and I've been keeping an eye on her for a long time. The words sent a chill down Daniel's spine. Why? Evelyn sighed, rubbing her forehead like she was debating how much to tell them. Because I owe it to Emily. Daniel's stomach dropped. You knew my wife? Evelyn nodded. A long time ago. Michael took another step closer, his voice filled with frustration. Then tell us the truth. No more riddles. No more games. What happened to Sarah? Evelyn hesitated, then finally spoke. After that day, the day they disappeared, Sarah wasn't taken by some stranger. She was placed with a family, couple. They raised her as their own. She grew up thinking she belonged to them. Evelyn swallowed. They changed her name, changed everything about her past. She doesn't remember any of it. Daniel's heart shattered. She was only 6 years old, Evelyn continued, young enough for them to mold her into whatever they wanted her to be. Daniel could barely breathe. Why? Evelyn's gaze was filled with something he couldn't quite decipher. Because Emily knew too much. The words felt like a slap. Daniel reeled back. What do you mean? Evelyn looked away, and for the first time he saw it, guilt. There are things I can't tell you yet, she admitted. But I can tell you this. Emily was trying to protect Sarah, and she made a mistake. A mistake that cost her everything. Daniel's legs felt weak. He gripped the back of a nearby bench for support. His mind raced through every possibility, every terrible what if. Michael's jaw clenched. You said you've been watching Sarah. Does she have any memories of us? At all? Evelyn hesitated. Daniel felt his chest tighten. Tell me the truth. Evelyn exhaled, then looked at him with something close to sympathy. I don't think so. Daniel felt the weight of those words crush him. But, Evelyn continued, sometimes memories don't stay buried forever. Hope flickered, faint but persistent. What are you saying? Evelyn studied him. I'm saying that if you really want to bring her back, you're going to have to remind her of who she was. The words settled between them, heavy with possibility. Daniel straightened, his resolve hardening. I'll do whatever it takes. Evelyn's lips pressed into a thin line. Then you need to be careful, because if you push too hard, you might lose her for good. Michael let out a slow breath. And if we don't push at all? Evelyn hesitated. Then she may never remember. Daniel's chest ached at the thought. She's in danger, Evelyn added after a moment. She doesn't know it, but she is. Michael's brows furrowed. From who? Evelyn hesitated, then shook her head. From people who don't want her past uncovered. Daniel felt his pulse quicken. Are you saying someone is watching her? Evelyn's silence was answer enough. Daniel took a deep breath, his hands trembling. He looked at Michael, then back at Evelyn. Tell me her name. Evelyn's lips parted slightly. She hesitated, like she was making a final decision. Then softly, she said, her name is Olivia. Daniel felt the name settle over him like a foreign weight. Olivia, he whispered, felt wrong and right all at once. Evelyn nodded. That's the only name she's ever known. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, they were filled with determination. Then we find Olivia, he said firmly, and we bring Sarah back. Evelyn hesitated. You're walking into something bigger than you realize. Daniel's voice didn't waver. I don't care. Evelyn sighed, shaking her head. You really are just like Emily. Something about the way she said it made his throat tighten. Michael looked at him. What now? Daniel took a steady breath. We find my daughter, he said, and nothing was going to stop him. Daniel couldn't stop saying the name in his head. Olivia, his daughter, his Sarah, had been living under a different name for the past 33 years. Felt foreign on his tongue, unfamiliar and wrong. She wasn't Olivia. She was Sarah Carter, his little girl, the child he had held in his arms, the one who had giggled when he lifted her high into the sky, the one who had disappeared into nothingness and left his world shattered. And now, after all this time, she had been right here, in the same city, living a life that wasn't hers. He clenched his fists as he sat across from Evelyn in the dim light of a small cafe. The rain outside blurred the windows, matching the storm inside him. Michael sat beside him, stiff and quiet, his gaze dark with conflicting emotions. Where is she now? Daniel asked, his voice strained. Evelyn stirred her tea with slow, deliberate motions. I can't tell you that. Daniel slammed his hand down on the table, the sound sharp against the soft hum of voices around them. You think I'm just going to walk away? You think I'll sit back and accept that my daughter is living a lie? Evelyn didn't flinch. She simply met his gaze with the calm patience of someone who had been expecting this reaction. If you go after her now, if you push too hard, you'll scare her off. And if that happens, you'll never get another chance. Daniel gritted his teeth. She deserves to know the truth. Evelyn sighed. Maybe, but that doesn't mean she's ready to hear it. Michael finally spoke, his voice quieter than usual. So what do we do? Evelyn hesitated. We wait. Daniel shook his head. No more waiting. I've waited 33 years. I won't wait a second longer. Evelyn leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice. Then you risk losing her forever. Daniel's breath hitched. Evelyn exhaled slowly, like she was weighing her next words carefully. Olivia, Sarah, whoever she is now, she has a life, family, career. She's built something for herself, and she believes it's real. If you go to her and rip it apart without giving her time to process, you won't just shock her. You'll break her. Daniel's hands curled into fists. The thought of his daughter looking at him with fear instead of recognition made his stomach twist painfully. Michael ran a hand through his hair. Then how do we do this? Evelyn was silent for a long moment before she finally said, You have to remind her. Daniel frowned. What do you mean? You need to trigger something in her, Evelyn explained. Memories aren't gone. They're just buried. People suppress things all the time. But the right sight, the right smell, the right moment, it can bring everything rushing back. Daniel swallowed hard. The thought that Sarah's memories were still inside her somewhere, waiting to be unlocked, sent a wave of hope through him. Michael frowned. But she was 6 when she disappeared. What if she doesn't remember enough for it to matter? Evelyn hesitated. There's only one way to find out. Daniel exhaled sharply. Then tell me where she is. Evelyn studied him for a long moment before finally pulling a folded piece of paper from her coat pocket. She slid it across the table. Daniel's hands trembled as he picked it up and unfolded it. An address. His heart pounded. That's where she works, Evelyn said. She's a photographer, specializes in portraits. Daniel's throat tightened. His daughter, his Sarah, was out there capturing the world through a lens, completely unaware that the past she had been searching for all her life was about to come crashing down around her. Daniel didn't hesitate. He drove straight to the address Evelyn had given him, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles ached. Michael sat beside him, silent but tense, watching his father carefully. When they arrived, Daniel felt his breath catch in his throat. The studio was small, tucked away on a quiet street. A sign out front read Olivia Hayes Photography. The name sent another stab of pain through his chest. She doesn't even know who she is, he whispered. Michael swallowed hard. So what now? Daniel exhaled, his mind racing. He couldn't just walk in there and announce the truth. Evelyn was right about that much. But he had to find a way to reach her. Then suddenly he knew. A memory resurfaced, clear as day. Sarah had been obsessed with photographs as a child. She used to sit on the floor for hours, flipping through old family albums, tracing her tiny fingers over the faces of people she barely knew. His father's picture had been her favorite. An idea took root in his mind. Without another word, Daniel put the car in park, reached into his wallet, and pulled out a small, worn photograph. It was an old Polaroid. His father, standing in front of their house, holding Sarah in his arms. She had been only 4 years old at the time, grinning with her 2 missing front teeth. Michael frowned as Daniel held up the photo. What are you doing? Daniel took a shaky breath. I'm going to leave it for her. Michael hesitated, then nodded. You think it'll work? Daniel's jaw clenched. I have to believe it will. He stepped out of the car, his heart pounding, and made his way to the entrance. His hands trembled as he carefully slipped the photo through the mail slot in the door. Then, without looking back, he turned and walked away. Michael met his gaze as he got back in the car. Now we wait. Daniel swallowed hard. Now we wait. But his mind was already racing ahead. If this didn't work, if Sarah didn't react, he would find another way. Because nothing was going to stop him from bringing his daughter home. The night felt endless. Daniel lay awake in his apartment, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts tangled in a web of hope and fear. He kept picturing Sarah, Olivia, finding the photograph. Would it stir something inside her? Would she recognize the little girl in the picture? Would she feel a pull toward a past she didn't even know she had? Or would she glance at it once, toss it aside, and never think of it again? The uncertainty gnawed at him. Michael had gone home hours ago, but Daniel knew his son was just as restless. They were both caught in the same inescapable limbo, waiting for something, anything, to happen. The minutes stretched into hours. Then, just as the first light of dawn crept through the blinds, his phone vibrated against the nightstand. His heart lurched. He grabbed it without hesitation, barely glancing at the unknown number before answering. Hello. His voice was hoarse. A pause. Then, who are you? Daniel's breath caught in his throat. It was her, Sarah. He sat up so fast the blankets fell from his body, his pulse thundering in his ears. Sarah. He stopped himself. He couldn't call her that. Not yet. He forced himself to say the name she knew. Olivia. Another pause. Her voice was quieter this time. How do you know me? Daniel closed his eyes for a brief moment, his chest tight with emotion. She called. She actually called. That meant something, didn't it? It meant the photo had reached her. It meant she had felt something. He swallowed hard. You found the picture. Another pause. Yes. His hands trembled as he gripped the phone. He wanted to say everything all at once. To tell her who he was. To tell her how long he had been searching. How much he had missed her. How much he loved her. But he couldn't. He had to be careful. Evelyn's warning echoed in his mind. If you push too hard, you might lose her forever. So he forced himself to stay calm. Where did you get it? She asked. Daniel hesitated. It belonged to someone very important to me. Silence. Then, the little girl in the photo? Who is she? His throat tightened. Who do you think she is? She didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, there was something fragile in her voice. She looks like me. Daniel's chest ached. She does, he whispered. Another long silence. He could hear her breathing, uneven and uncertain. Finally, she said, I want to meet you. Daniel's heart stopped. He hadn't expected that. His grip on the phone tightened. Are you sure? I don't know, she admitted. But I need to know why you left that photo. I need to understand. Daniel swallowed hard. Tell me where. She hesitated. Then, finally, she said, the park on 8th. Noon. His fingers tightened around the phone. I'll be there. The call ended. For a long moment, Daniel just sat there, staring at the screen. She wanted to meet. She wanted to meet. A breath left his lungs, shaky and uneven. His chest felt tight, his heart too big for his ribs. This was it. The moment he had been waiting for. And yet, deep inside, he was terrified. What if she didn't believe him? What if she walked away? What if, after all these years, he lost her all over again? But no, he couldn't think that way. He had to believe that she would feel the truth, even if she couldn't remember it. Because she was his daughter, and that meant no matter what had been taken from her, somewhere deep inside, she would know. The park was quiet when Daniel arrived. A few families walked along the paths, their laughter distant and unimportant. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it a crisp autumn chill. He stood near the benches, hands in his pockets, trying to steady his nerves. Then he saw her. She walked toward him slowly, her movements hesitant, her expression guarded. She was wearing a beige coat, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She looked the same as she had in the club, so familiar it made his chest ache. His daughter, his Sarah. She stopped a few feet away, studying him carefully. You're the one who left the picture. Daniel swallowed the lump in his throat. Yes. She hesitated. Why? He exhaled slowly. Because I thought you should have it. She frowned slightly. Why me? He met her eyes. Because I think the little girl in that photo is you. She sucked in a sharp breath. Her fingers twitched at her sides. That's not possible, she said quickly, shaking her head. I have pictures of myself as a kid. That's not me. Daniel's chest tightened. Are you sure? She hesitated. She wasn't sure. That was something. She looked away, crossing her arms. This doesn't make sense. Daniel's voice was gentle. Maybe it does. She looked at him again, and for the first time he saw something flicker in her eyes. Fear, doubt, recognition. Daniel took a small step forward. Olivia, do you ever feel like there's something missing? Like there's a part of your life you can't quite remember? Her breath hitched. Bingo. Her arms tightened around herself. Sometimes, she admitted. Daniel felt his heart clench. She knows. Even if she couldn't explain it, even if she had spent her life pushing it down, she knew. His voice was soft. I think there's a reason for that. She shook her head again, stepping back. I don't understand what you're saying. He took a steadying breath. He had to be careful. If he said too much, if he forced it, she'd run. So instead, he simply said, You deserve to know the truth. She stared at him, her breathing uneven. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she whispered, Who are you? His chest ached. He wanted to tell her everything, but he wasn't sure she was ready to hear it. So instead, he simply said, Someone who's been looking for you for a very long time. She looked away, her jaw tight, her hands clenched into fists. her body tense with uncertainty. Then, finally, she whispered, "I don't know what to believe." Daniel swallowed past the lump in his throat. "I'll wait until you do." She hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Okay." Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And for now, that was enough. Daniel barely slept that night. His mind was trapped in an endless cycle of replaying every moment from the meeting at the park, analyzing every detail, every hesitation in Sarah's, Olivia's voice, the way she had looked at him, the flicker of something buried deep in her expression, something fragile, something uncertain. It had been there for only a second, but he had seen it. She knew something wasn't right. She felt it. She just didn't know how to explain it yet. That was all the proof he needed to keep going. Michael sat across from him in the small kitchen, nursing a cup of coffee, his expression unreadable. He hadn't spoken much since Daniel told him what happened at the park. He had just listened, nodding occasionally, his brows drawn together as if he was deep in thought. Finally, after a long silence, he set the cup down with a quiet clink against the table. "She called you." Daniel nodded. "And she wanted to meet." Another nod. Michael exhaled. "Then we have a chance." Daniel looked up, locking eyes with his son. There was something different in his expression now, determination. He believed it, too. "We can't rush her," Daniel said carefully. "If we push too hard, she'll shut down." Michael nodded. "So what do we do?" Daniel rubbed a hand down his face. "We have to make her remember on her own." Evelyn was right. Memories don't disappear. They just get buried. Michael hesitated before leaning forward slightly. "Do you think she wants to remember?" Daniel thought about that for a long moment. Then, finally, he said, "I think she's afraid to." Michael swallowed. "Then we have to make her feel safe enough to want the truth." Daniel nodded, his chest tight with emotion. "Yeah, we do." The next day, Daniel parked across the street from Olivia Hayes Photography, watching from a distance. He wasn't here to interfere. He wasn't here to push. He just needed to see her again, even if it was from afar. And then, as if fate were working in his favor, he saw her step out of the building. She was alone, wearing a simple coat over her sweater, her hair pulled into a loose bun. She looked lost. Her eyes darted around, unfocused, like she was deep in thought, wrestling with something she couldn't quite grasp. Daniel held his breath. She took a few hesitant steps, then pulled out her phone. A moment later, his phone vibrated. His heart stopped. He fumbled for it, staring at the screen. Unknown number. His fingers trembled as he answered. "Hello." A long pause. Then, in a quiet, hesitant voice, "It's me." Daniel's throat tightened. Sarah, his daughter. He closed his eyes for a brief second, swallowing past the lump in his throat. "I'm here." Another pause. Then, "Can we talk?" Daniel's breath hitched. "Yes." They met at a small cafe, tucked away from the busy streets. It was quiet, the kind of place where people went to escape for a while. Daniel arrived first, his heart racing, his hands gripping the edge of the table as he waited. Then the door opened. She stepped inside, her movements hesitant, her expression unreadable. She looked around for a second before spotting him. Their eyes met. Something inside Daniel broke. She looked like Emily, not just in the way she moved or the way she carried herself, but in the way she hesitated before stepping forward, as if she wasn't sure if she was making the right choice. Emily had done that too. Sarah, Olivia, crossed the room, her arms folded across her chest as she sat down across from him. Silence stretched between them for a long moment. Then finally she exhaled. "I don't know why I'm here." Daniel forced himself to breathe. "I'm glad you are." She fidgeted with the sleeve of her sweater. "I saw the picture again this morning." His heart pounded. "And," she hesitated, I keep feeling like I should remember it, but I don't." Daniel leaned forward slightly, his voice soft. "That's okay." She blinked. "It is." He nodded. "Memories are tricky. Sometimes they come back in pieces. Sometimes they take time. She looked down at her hands, biting her lip. I don't understand why this is happening. I have a life, a family. She shook her head. This doesn't make sense. Daniel hesitated before asking, what do you remember about your childhood? She frowned. Everything. I think so. But can you picture it? He asked gently. She opened her mouth, then hesitated. A shadow passed over her face. It was subtle, but Daniel saw it. Doubt. She looked away, shaking her head. I don't know. Daniel's voice remained steady. That's because someone gave you memories to fill in the gaps. But they're not real, Olivia. She flinched. He saw it in her eyes, fear. And yet, she didn't get up. She didn't leave. She was listening. That was enough. For now. They talked for over an hour. At first, she kept her guard up, answering in short, clipped sentences. But as the conversation stretched on, she softened. She told him about her life, about the things she loved, about the family she had known. Daniel listened, his heart breaking a little more with every word. None of it was real, and yet it was all she knew. When the conversation finally lulled, she exhaled. I still don't know what to believe. Daniel nodded. That's okay. She hesitated, then looked at him carefully. What do you want from me? His breath caught. He wanted to tell her everything. But instead, he said, I just want you to keep asking questions. She frowned slightly. Why? Because the truth is already inside you, he whispered. You just have to be ready to see it. She swallowed hard. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then finally, she nodded. And Daniel knew they were getting closer. Daniel barely noticed the world around him as he walked through the city streets, his mind consumed by everything that had happened in the cafe. Sarah, Olivia, had sat across from him, confused, afraid, yet undeniably curious. That was the key. That was what mattered. She wasn't rejecting everything outright. Something inside her had begun to crack, small fissures forming in the carefully constructed life that had been built around her. It was working, but it wasn't enough. He needed to do more. He needed to show her. Michael had called twice since the meeting, but Daniel hadn't answered. He wasn't ready to talk about it yet. Not until he had a plan. Not until he figured out the next step. The cold air bit at his skin as he crossed the street, his hands shoved into his coat pockets. The city lights flickered above him, neon reflections gliding over the wet pavement. He kept walking, his mind running through the same thoughts over and over. How do you bring back memories someone doesn't even know they've lost? Then suddenly he knew. The house. The one they had lived in before it all fell apart. The one where Sarah had spent the first 6 years of her life. If anything could bring her back, it was that place. He turned on his heel, already reaching for his phone. He needed Michael. He needed Evelyn. He needed to find out if the house still existed. If it had been torn down, if someone else was living there, if there was anything left of the life they had once known. Because if there was even the smallest chance that stepping inside those walls could trigger something in Sarah, he was going to take it. No matter what it cost. Michael's voice was tense over the phone. Dad, slow down. What are you saying? Daniel gripped the steering wheel, his car idling at a red light. The house, Michael. The one we lived in before Mom and Sarah disappeared. Do you know if it's still there? Michael hesitated. Yeah, I think so. Why? Daniel's grip tightened. Because I need to take Sarah there. Michael's breath caught. You think that'll work? I don't know, Daniel admitted. But I have to try. Michael exhaled. Okay, let me look into it. I'll call you back. Daniel nodded, ending the call. His heart pounded as he stared at the road ahead. The streetlights blurred through the windshield, and for the first time in years, he felt something dangerously close to hope. Took Michael less than an hour to call back. It's still there, he said. Nobody's lived in it for years. It's been on the market forever, but no one's bought it. Daniel's chest tightened. Do you think we can get inside? Michael hesitated. Maybe. I can make some calls. Daniel didn't have time to wait for maybe. He was already turning the car in the direction of the neighborhood. I'm going now. Michael sighed. Of course you are. Daniel hung up. 15 minutes later, he was there. He parked in front of the house and just stared. It was strange, seeing it again after all these years. The paint had faded, the once bright blue exterior now dull and weathered. The front porch sagged slightly, the windows dark and empty. Weeds had overtaken the yard, creeping up the sides of the house like nature was trying to reclaim it. But it was still their house, the place where he had tucked Sarah into bed, the place where Emily had danced in the kitchen, laughing as she made breakfast, the place where their family had been whole. Daniel swallowed hard and stepped out of the car. The fence was still there, the wood splintered but sturdy. He ran a hand along the top of it, his fingers catching on an old carving. S+M. Sarah and Michael. His breath hitched. He had forgotten about that. She had made Michael help her carve it when she was 5, too little to do it herself. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, overwhelmed by the rush of memories. Then, slowly, he walked up the front steps. The door was locked, but that didn't matter. Michael had already texted him the number of a real estate agent who could get them inside. But Daniel didn't want to go in alone. Sarah needed to be here, and she needed to feel something. The next morning, Daniel sat in his car outside Sarah's studio, waiting. She arrived just after 9, her expression tired, her shoulders hunched slightly. She hadn't slept well. That much was obvious. Good. It meant she was thinking about it. About him. About the truth. He stepped out of the car, calling out before she could disappear inside. Olivia. She stopped, turning slowly. You again. Daniel smiled. Me again. She sighed, crossing her arms. Why are you here? He hesitated. Then, finally, he said, I want to show you something. She frowned. What? Daniel took a deep breath. A place. A place that might help you understand. She shifted on her feet. I don't know if. No expectations. Daniel cut in. Just, let me show you. And if you feel nothing, I'll walk away. Her brows furrowed. You'd walk away? Daniel nodded. If you truly believe this is all a mistake, I won't force you to keep listening. She studied him for a long moment. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she exhaled. Fine. One time, Daniel's chest ached with relief. She was giving him a chance. That was all he needed. The drive to the house was silent. Sarah stared out the window, her fingers tapping against her thigh, restless and uncertain. When they finally pulled up, she frowned. Where are we? Daniel parked and turned to her. Just, come inside. She hesitated. Then, slowly, she followed him up the front steps. Daniel unlocked the door and pushed it open, stepping aside to let her in first. She took a cautious step forward, her eyes scanning the room. Then, she froze. Daniel's heart pounded. Sarah's breath hitched as she stared at the old wooden floor, her fingers tightening around the strap of her purse. He saw it. That flicker of recognition. Something inside her knew. This? Her voice was barely a whisper. I've seen this before. Daniel swallowed hard. You have. She turned slowly, her eyes filled with something between confusion and fear. Why do I know this place? Daniel took a step closer. Because it was your home. Sarah blinked rapidly, her breathing uneven. No, that's not. But she couldn't finish the sentence. Because she didn't know. Daniel's voice was gentle. Look around. Let yourself feel it. Sarah turned back to the house, her expression tight. Then slowly she walked forward. Her fingers skimmed the old furniture, tracing invisible memories. She paused near the staircase, her breath hitching. I used to... She stopped herself, shaking her head. No, I don't remember. Daniel's chest ached. Yes, you do. She clenched her jaw. No, I don't. But there were tears in her eyes. And Daniel knew. She was starting to remember. Sarah stood frozen in the middle of the house, her breathing unsteady, her fingers trembling at her sides. The light from the windows cast long shadows across the wooden floor, and for a moment, she felt like she was standing between two worlds. The life she had always known and the one that was trying to force its way back in. Daniel watched her carefully, his heart pounding. He could see it, the cracks forming, the memories clawing their way to the surface. She felt something, even if she didn't understand it yet, even if she was fighting against it, the truth was there. She knew this place. She knew something wasn't right. Her breath hitched as she took a hesitant step forward. "I don't understand," she whispered. Daniel swallowed hard, his voice gentle. "It's okay." She turned to him, her eyes filled with confusion and something else. Fear. "Why do I remember this place?" Daniel took a slow step closer. "Because this was your home." She shook her head, backing away. No, that's not possible." Daniel's chest ached. "It is." Sarah's hands clenched into fists. "I grew up in Seattle. I had parents, a childhood, a whole life before I ever moved here." Daniel inhaled deeply. "What do you actually remember, Sarah?" She flinched at the name. He saw it, the tiny flicker of recognition in her eyes before she quickly buried it. Her lips parted, but no words came out, because she didn't know. She had been given memories, fed a life that was never really hers. And now, standing in this house, the foundation of that life was crumbling. Daniel stepped toward her, slow and careful. "I know this is overwhelming. I know you feel like this doesn't make sense. But it does, Sarah. It does. You just have to let yourself remember." Her jaw clenched. "My name is Olivia." Daniel's voice softened. "Are you sure?" Her eyes darted away, her breath quick and uneven. She wasn't sure. Not anymore. Her fingers brushed against the staircase railing, and suddenly, she staggered. Daniel lunged forward. "Sarah?" She squeezed her eyes shut, gripping the railing, her breathing ragged. Her body trembled, a pained expression crossing her face. Flashes, images, a woman's voice, warm and familiar. "Hold the railing, sweetheart. Don't run up the stairs." A small giggle, tiny feet racing up the steps. A man's laugh, deep and full of love. "You're too fast for me, Peanut." A pair of hands lifting her into the air. A feeling of safety, a feeling of home. Her eyes flew open. She turned to Daniel, her chest rising and falling quickly. "What was my favorite color?" she demanded. Daniel's throat tightened. "Purple." Her lip trembled. "What was my favorite bedtime story?" Daniel's voice was barely a whisper. "The Velveteen Rabbit." Her hands gripped the railing tighter. "What did I always ask for on my birthday?" Daniel swallowed past the lump in his throat. "A chocolate cake with strawberries on top." Sarah's breath caught. Tears filled her eyes. Because she knew. She didn't know how, she didn't know why, but she knew. The memories had been buried deep, but they were still inside her, fighting their way back. Daniel's voice was soft but full of conviction. "You're my daughter. You are Sarah Carter." Her lips parted, a silent gasp escaping. She shook her head, but the denial wasn't strong. It was weak, uncertain. I don't know." Her voice broke. Daniel took another step, his eyes pleading. "Sarah, look at me." She did. His heart ached at the sight of her, the little girl he had lost, now a grown woman standing before him, broken and confused. "You were taken from me," Daniel whispered. "Someone stole you. They made you forget. But you're still here. You're still my daughter." Tears slipped down her cheeks. Daniel's own vision blurred. Then, slowly, hesitantly, she reached for him. A sob tore from Daniel's throat as he pulled her into his arms. 33 years. 33 years of searching, of grieving, of never knowing if she was alive or dead. And now she was here, crying in his arms, clutching onto him like she was afraid to let go, like she was afraid she might disappear again. Daniel held her tighter, pressing his lips against her hair. "I've got you, Peanut. I've got you." Sarah sobbed harder. For the first time in her life, the name Olivia felt like a lie, and Sarah felt like the truth. She clung to him, the memories rushing in faster now. Michael, her mother, birthdays, Christmas mornings, falling asleep in her father's arms. A life she had never known she lost. And now it was all coming back. Finally, after 33 years, she knew who she was, and she knew where she belonged. With him, with her family. She buried her face in his chest, shaking, crying, whispering the only word that mattered. Dad. Daniel's body trembled, his own tears falling freely now. His little girl was home, and for the first time in decades, his heart was whole again. To be continued? Final cliffhanger note. As Daniel holds Sarah, believing their nightmare is over, a shadow lingers just outside the house. Watching, waiting, someone who doesn't want Sarah to remember, someone who isn't ready to let her go. Because secrets like these don't stay buried forever. And this story,